Story 1. My father's kidney stone. Now, I know this sounds messed up. I was an idiot when I was 11, probably had 3 brain cells fighting for air most of the time. I came home from school. No one was home, and I saw a package of Nerds candy on the table. Beside it was a paper towel with a unique black nerd. Curious about this black nerd, I decided not to think about it and instead just eat it. It was gritty and horrible. It didn't taste like much, and I chalked it up to being an error in the Nerds factory. Fast forward an hour later. I'm playing games on the family computer when I hear my dad desperately ask, "Where's my kidney stone?" To which I reply in anguish, "I ate it." I'm crying. My parents are laughing hysterically, and my dad has to tell his doctor that his kid ate his kidney stone thinking it was candy. My nickname for years was Nerd. Not my proudest moment. Story 2. That drink they give you in the hospital when you have to get a colonoscopy. Not the one in bottles. This was the one dissolved in water. Couldn't drink it. I tried so hard. It was the worst tasting thing I've ever had. I earned myself an extra day in the hospital and another whole round of it because I didn't drink enough of it the first day. I was convinced I was in hell. Story 3. I was going to make buttercream frosting for a cake and kept tasting it as I went to make sure the flavor was on point. I noticed something a bit off and a little gooey and finally realized that there were small moths in the frosting. I guess they had gotten into the powdered sugar, and I had been eating moths that whole time. After vomiting in the sink and dumping that batch, I found a recipe that didn't require the powdered sugar, and that is how I discovered almond frosting. Never looked back. Story 4. So, I have a weird phobia where I have to rinse out every glass before I use it, even if it's at my own house or a plastic cup. It stems from when I was in 5th grade and stayed over at a friend's house. The mother was a hoarder, but this was before anyone knew that term, and I was certainly too young to know it. Her fridge was the typical overstocked, warm mess you see on TV. She made me a glass of Ovaltine for breakfast after sleepover, and on top, it had all the bits of crystalline stuff you get from the glasses in dishwashers that aren't cleaned regularly, plus a few random dog hairs. I didn't want to drink it, but she said I had to, so I did, and it was lukewarm with bits floating on top. I've rinsed every single glass I touched since then, and even my good friends rinse one for me when I'm over. Story 5. Kani miso. I saw it on the sushi train menu, thinking it was miso and crab. Kani miso is actually made from a crab's brains and internal organs. It tasted like rancid seafood with the texture of wet cement. I was with some Japanese teachers who were hosting us on a school trip, so I had to swallow out of politeness. I managed to somehow covertly squirrel the second piece from the plate into a napkin, which I carried down the street before disposing of it in a bin out of sight of the hosting teachers. Story 6. Popped open a bottle of Mountain Dew to make a cocktail. Not only did I waste a hefty amount of vodka, I also inadvertently swallowed my friend's urine. Ended up spending the next 10 minutes gagging and lost my immunity to noxious smells afterward. Story 7. On my first date, I took my girlfriend to a fancy restaurant. I was trying hard to impress her. We shared an appetizer charcuterie. There was some kind of mustard-like substance that she didn't want to try. I actually like mustard, so I said I would try it. To this day, I have never tasted anything more repulsive and texturally traumatizing. I gagged uncontrollably while she laughed her face off. We've been married for 6 years. Story 8. As a teenager, I lived in an old farmhouse in the Australian wheat belt that was infested with rats. We used to poison them, and they would die in the ceiling, making the whole house smell for days. Anyway, one night I made a grilled cheese toast tie under the gas grill. I started eating it when my brother asked me what was underneath it. I turned it over, and the bottom of the bread was covered in bright green poisoned rat droppings. Story 9. A coin. My sibling and I were playing with coins in our mouths when I was 3, and my sibling said something along the lines of, "That coin's too big." And I was like, "Oh yeah? Watch this." Then I put the coin in my mouth and swallowed it by accident. Story 10. A cockroach. It had climbed into my coffee cup, and since the coffee was black, I didn't see it. I knocked back the rest of the coffee, and by the time I realized what it was, I had already started to swallow. Story 11. bought an artisanal blue cheese from a cheese shop one time. I love blue cheese, so I was excited. Unfortunately, that was the day I learned that in the cheese world, the word artisanal is apparently code for we accidentally made the worst possible product and need a fancy buzzword to make it sell. You know how normal blue cheese is super creamy, sharp, and tangy? Yeah, this had none of that. Tasted like a skunk orgy at a rainy barnyard. The taste in my mouth was identical to the scent of skunk spray, wet hay, and cow manure. And no matter how much I brushed my teeth and ate breath mints, the taste stayed there for a solid 24 hours. Story 12. When I was 2 or 3, I drank white spirit I found under the cupboards, thinking it was lemonade. That is turpentine if you're in the United States. I had to get my stomach pumped. Story 13. Extra long ramen noodle. I was struggling with one end being deep down my throat and the other still being in my mouth. After realizing that I could still breathe fine, I decided to swallow and chase it with a drink. It was incredibly uncomfortable, like I wasn't sure if I was going to make it out of this one, and then I went right back to eating. Story 14. Back in the day, I was riding around with a friend. She was driving us to a party. I opened a beer, dropped the cap into the drink, and had a few sips. She pulled into a convenience store and we both went in. We returned to her car and headed out to the party. I took a gulp of beer, and something landed in my mouth. No big deal, I spat it out into my hand. It wasn't the cap. It was a cockroach. Story 15. My own vomit. I had to undergo reconstructive jaw surgery 2 years ago. They wire your mouth and jaw shut for the first 2 to 3 months. Given my medical history, which has included chemotherapy, I tend to react badly to postoperative medications. Me. So, like, how am I supposed to puke if or when the painkillers you prescribe after surgery make me sick? Cue awkward silence. Doctor. Stares at me intensely. Doctor. Well, better hope you don't puke. We can also prescribe you antiemetics just in case. The antiemetics they prescribed me helped very little. Swallowing your own vomit is a 0 out of 10 experience. If I could give it negative stars, I would. Story 16. As I scroll through each one, EW, that one's even worse. EW, this is gross. That's terrible. This is so disgusting. Yet I keep scrolling on. Story 17. Ants and weevils, loads of them. Every time I brewed myself a cup of tea or coffee, I would have some floating black bits in the cup. I used to think that it was just from the coffee or the tea bag, but I was wrong. One day, I decided to pour some milk in my coffee, and the floating bits were clearly visible. Insects. I inspected my kettle and found loads of dead weevils and ants there. Suffice to say, I wash my kettle a lot more frequently nowadays. Story 18. I went to my girlfriend's house, and her mom made flautas. Growing up, I had only ever eaten them at my mom's and would devour them. My girlfriend and her family used proper etiquette. I'm talking about a base plate for plates and cups, with each food item having its own plate, stuff I never did. I grabbed a flauta and bit into it. I wondered why there was such a hard crunch to it. It must be burnt fried. I didn't want to look uncultured and dig into my mouth, so I swallowed it. It hurt my throat all the way. I went for the second flauta, and it was the same deal. I'm like, no way they are this burnt to have such a super hard texture and not break apart. I dug the burnt part out of my mouth and realized it was a toothpick. Her mom leaves the toothpicks in when serving, as opposed to my mom, who took them out all my life, and I never knew they were used while cooking. Story 19. I learned the hard way that an ex did not wash his backside, genital area, or groin. At all. I cannot describe the smell for you. Let's just say oral sex was virtually impossible. And I'm not proud of how long it took me to figure out the problem. I also got such severe bacterial vaginosis from him that at one point I required 3 months of antibiotics and developed pelvic inflammatory disease, without a typical sexually transmitted disease. He didn't wash his bedding either. Story 20. Growing up, my grandmother was notorious for losing her fingernails as she cooked. My family has pretty poor fingernails. I've broken them just turning on my car, and it's push button. So the family tradition was $10 every time you located grandma's fingernails. Unfortunately, you didn't get paid if you actually ate them, which is why I am not a millionaire today. I was too afraid of getting into trouble for spitting out food. Story 21. Apparently, when I was little, I broke and ate my grandmother's real pearl necklace. They had to continuously check my poo so they could collect all the pearls and have it remade. Story 22. One time, I poured a glass of milk, and it looked fine. I took a swig of milk, and it was fine. I took a second drink and got a big curd of congealed milk. Story 23. When I was younger, I found a quarter near my bed and was so excited. I didn't want to lose it, so I popped it in my mouth before falling asleep. I passed it out the next day and then cried because it had poo on it. Story 24. I dropped a plate with food on it once, and it looked fine, so I just put it all back together. Once I finished, I realized the plate was now chipped, and the hard bits I ate were a part of the plate. Story 25. When I was around 6 to 7 years old, my father was into urine therapy. One day, I walked into the bathroom and noticed a bottle filled with yellow liquid. My father also used to make apple juice, which looked almost identical to urine. Without thinking, I assumed it was the juice and poured myself a glass. After taking a sip, I immediately realized something was terribly wrong. It wasn't juice, it was urine. A wave of horror and disgust hit me, and I think it was one of the most unpleasant experiences of my life. I barely managed to hold back from vomiting, but the taste of that liquid stayed in my memory forever. Story 26. When I was pledging my fraternity years ago, we had to play an elimination game to see who could drink increasingly gross concoctions without throwing up. If you threw up, you lost. I tapped out at a mixture of coffee grounds, pickle juice, cottage cheese, orange juice, mayonnaise, relish, mustard, onions, and chopped sardines. Reading it doesn't sound gross, but just thinking about the texture makes me want to gag. Story 27. As a teenager, I went to my dad's house for a long weekend, came back to my mom's and realized I had left some apple juice on my nightstand, and it had gotten moldy on top. It was late, so I went straight to sleep and figured I'd dump it in the morning. I woke up completely delirious in the middle of the night, super thirsty and half-conscious. I took a couple of quick sips before I snapped out of it. I still remember what it tasted like, and sometimes my brain likes to remind me of it out of nowhere. It was horrible. Story 28. I was drinking beer outside with my friends and having a few cigarettes. I picked up my beer and drank it before realizing that people had been ashing out in my leftover drink. Thinking it was empty, I immediately started throwing up. Worst taste ever. Story 29. When I was a kid, I got a bouncy ball stuck in my throat. Luckily, it came out. Otherwise, I would have probably died that day. That trauma has taught me not to swallow some things. Story 30. This isn't mine, but I saw a TikTok of a girl who said she always eats rice in bed. Every time she'd find a grain of rice, she'd eat it, only to learn her cat had parasites and she was eating the eggs that fell out of the cat's rear. Story 31. 2 hours ago, I just swallowed old pineapple juice that was left open in the fridge too long, and it was disgusting. When I poured it out, it was black. I couldn't see the inside of the can, so I had no idea and didn't stop to smell it. A pro tip from TikTok: take a shot of liquor after you eat or drink something bad, and it will help prevent food sickness. And it worked. Story 32. Spoiled chocolate milk from the school cafeteria. I chugged it straight from the carton and had already taken a big gulp before I realized it was jelly-like and kind of sour. Story 33. I knew a guy that, when he was a teen, he partied and smoked marijuana. He was high and thirsty, so he took a big drink out of a soda can. It was the spit can for everyone else. He never smoked marijuana again. Story 34. Not me, but it was me. A friend and I were smoking methamphetamine out of a glass pipe, and he spilled the hot liquid methamphetamine on my hairy forearm. Not wanting to waste a drop of the drug, he immediately licked it off my arm. I've never seen anyone change colors and vomit that quickly. The combination of melted skin, burnt hair, and crystal methamphetamine was foul-smelling. I can't imagine how it tasted. Story 35. Barium sulfate. It is a radiographic contrast agent you have to drink for some medical tests. I have a messed up stomach, so I have had to have several tests with it over the years. The thought of it makes me nauseous. Story 36. Playing with my baby brother, lying on my back, throwing him up and down. He was laughing his head off until he puked down my throat. It's all fun and games until... Story 37. Liquid potassium supplement. I was in the hospital and my potassium was low, so first I was given a huge potassium pill. Then, about an hour later, I received a shot glass-sized dose of liquid potassium. It was thick, slightly sweet, and extremely salty. I had to drink an entire cup of water just to start getting the taste out of my mouth. Story 38. A large moth. I felt travel sick in the back of the car. I opened the window a couple of inches and tried to breathe in fresh air. A big moth whacked into my mouth and went straight to the back, and I swallowed it. I bet it got a bigger shock than me. Anyway, they stopped the car, and I threw up on the pavement. I can still taste the horrible thing if I think about it. Story 39. Vomited a peanut butter lar bar the other day. The slug-like feeling of the first half coming up my esophagus was so gross that I tried to swallow down the second half as it was being vomited. I was unsuccessful. 0 out of 10, do not recommend. Story 40. When I was 18, we had a big party at my grandfather's ranch. After drinking the whole night, I woke up hungover. I got to the fridge and saw a Coca-Cola bottle, drank it, and then realized it's pig blood. He stored it there to use it for sausages he makes. It was a horrible experience. I vomited all around the kitchen, but I learned a lesson to always check what is in the bottle before drinking it.